Hello, and welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Thank you for being here today. I know you have a lot of choices. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. If you can, please take 10 seconds and drop a rating or a review on Apple, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds on your end can help me get better and help other Cub fans find the show. You can also now help support the CubsPS Plus podcast by going to cubspsplus.patreon.com. There are 4 support tiers that come with added perks such as access to a private Discord discussion group, access to bonus episodes, merchandise discounts in the merch store that will launch in the coming weeks, and the ability to submit priority questions ahead of time for interview guests and more. Your support will help me keep this podcast ad-free. Welcome into episode 33. This week I'm thrilled to welcome back friend of the pod, Greg Huss of Northside Bound and host of the Cubs on Deck podcast. Greg is always a great listen, and this was no exception. As always, he brings big energy and a lot of knowledge about the young players in the Cubs system. We talk primarily about power arms and power bats that the Cubs have in the system and how that power plays into roster construction for a team generally seen as light on power at the major league level. When might we see Matt Mervis or Christopher Morel come up to Chicago? Can we get some more swing and miss by using some of the bullpen arms at Iowa? We'll find out. Late in the episode, Greg introduces his new offensive metric, BASH, and tells us how it can be used to compare Cubs prospects across the different levels of the system. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Hey, this week with the Cubs on a roll, I'm thrilled to be joined by Greg Huss of Northside Bound and the Cubs Den podcast. Welcome back, Greg. You're the first multi-time visitor on this podcast.
I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a big honor. I'm appreciative of being on the show, and what you put together here is honestly terrific. I love the show.
Thank you so much. Before we really dive into what I want to talk about, did you get to see Cade Horton start last night?
Yeah, so actually last night, so I a lot of times what I've been doing so far this year is I've been going, I haven't been able to watch it live because, as you know, I've been in the process of moving. So in the evenings, I've been like moving all my stuff from my current place to my new place. And I've been going back late at night and watching starts by different starting pitchers, basically laying in bed. I just used the 10-second ahead feature on the MILB TV feed, so I can watch every pitch like all in a row. It's been great. But last night was an example of that, where I was actually not moving, but I was with some friends last night, and I was at the bar, and because the Pelicans were on Marquee, they had Marquee going to the bar. I was able to kind of watch Cade Horton start in that way, and then I went back and watched it later in the evening, and yeah, it was an impressive start for sure.
Yeah, I was saying my 12-year-old had a baseball game last night, so I got home and turned the game on, but by that point he was already out. So, but he's going to be fun to watch. Hopefully we can keep that on healthy.
I think that he has had really it's been a tough situation for him since he's been drafted, right? Where I think that the initial reaction from Cubs fans were, this is not the pick that we want, because there are other players, not because they were against Cade Horton, but just because there were other players on the board in the draft that fans wanted to see on the Cubs. And so he kind of was like behind the 8 ball right out the gate with Cubs fans. And then we didn't see him last year because he was coming off the college season, coming off Tommy John, all that good stuff. So it was a pretty honestly, last night's start at home for the Pelicans was like a big start. These first 2 have been great for him. But it's been important as far as like from a fan's perspective too, I think.
Yeah. No, it's been great. And he was somebody who there were a lot of guys projected, and I think because of the injury and because he really had struggled through most of the season until he hit the postseason, really just wasn't on Cubs fans' radar. Like you watch, because most people don't dig into it the way you guys do. You know, they're looking at the projections and who's expected to go in the top 30, top 40.
And it's really easy.
He was
to
not
look
a guy
ERA.
I heard a lot about.
Right,
What's that?
Looking at ERA is really easy, and his college ERA last year was 4.5 or something like that.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
People look at that, they're like, we just drafted a guy 7th overall that has a 4.5 ERA. It's like, I mean, technically, yes, he does, yes. but he doesn't really, you know?
Right. So, well, that's cool. I love having all the access to minor league TV now. I mean, being able to go back and I don't watch a lot of games. I'm hoping to get down to Myrtle Beach at some point. Charlotte's only 3.5 hours away. but just to have access to it, to be able to tune in. And I saw, one of the guys we'll talk about later is Morel. I saw he already hit a homer today in the game against Iowa, his 5th.
Yeah,
dude's
wild.
just killing it. So last time we talked, I brought you on. It was postseason. It was before the Rule 5. I think it was a week or two before the Rule 5. And we just talked through the system, kind of guys you liked, development. I want to take that a step further now. So when the Cubs came out of spring training, they had a lot of tough roster decisions to make. And there's a lot of, frankly, there's some fan angst and some legitimate, probably some not so much, about how the roster was constructed. And I think there are a lot of decisions made where you've got guys who you invited to camp, non-roster invitees that maybe made a big impression. Some signees like Eric Hosmer, who is a veteran. He's shown he can do it, but he's not very expensive. And frankly, he's not performing very well right now. And I want to talk through how you use the system then to put a major league team on the field. Like the prospects are great. I love hearing about PCA and the Jaguar. But, Kevin Alcantara is 20 and he's playing A-ball. He's not really probably realistic for the Cubs maybe late next year if he really explodes. But he's not helping this year's team make the playoffs. So I guess when I look at the minor leagues, I see 3 primary roles of the minor leagues. And then I'll get your thoughts on it too. You want to feed the big league club with depth. And we see that today with Jameson Taillon's going to miss his start and Javier Assad's coming up. You want to be able to develop starter level talent. And the Cubs now finally do have guys both on pitching side and hitting side that have come up through the system. Justin Steele looks incredible. Obviously got guys like Ian Happ. And then be trade bait. And I know you and Brian yesterday talked a little bit about what the Happ extension means. And it may mean that some of these outfielders are trade bait. I mean, is that kind of how you see it as well?
Yeah, actually, you just summed up the entire basis of our podcast in 3 bullet points. It's incredible. Yeah, man, you kind of nailed that. Where just because you're following prospects come up through the Cubs system does not necessarily mean that their ultimate goal is to be a stud for the Chicago Cubs in however many years. I think Max Bain said it on his old podcast on the Bain campaign with my new co-host Brian Smith. He said it with him that it almost feels like for players as if yeah, you take pride in being a part of the Cubs organization or being a part of whatever organization you're a part of, but it's just one seasons long tryout for the big leagues no matter the team, right? So you're trying out to make the big league team with the Cubs, or if not that, then be selected in the Rule 5 draft, and if not that, be traded away to a different team, and if not that, you want to make the big leagues for a team. It doesn't necessarily need to be the Cubs, and that's kind of the way the minor league system is set up. And I think that you see guys through the system every single we watch guys that perform, and they're out there having great games, and they're having 2 home run games, or they're having 3 shutout innings on the mound, things like that. And they may just be depth in the major league level, or they may not make the major leagues. And these guys are all so talented, dude. They're so talented. It's unbelievable. And so I guess my point is that any of these guys have the talent to make the big leagues. It's just a matter of consistency and kind of making the peak of their performance be as consistent and as they do that over the course of an entire season as much as possible, if that makes sense.
It does, and I think that leads into the next point. You and Brian talked about this week. When you put that roster together, when the Cubs come out of spring training, they put together a roster that I think, frankly, had a pretty high floor. But certainly not the max ceiling they could have. If you look at the roster, Christopher Morel probably is a better baseball player right now than Edwin Rios. But which one makes the most sense to be on the roster opening day to help the Cubs win baseball games? Not have the most talent on the roster. I mean, that's something those minor leaguers have to deal with all the time.
Yeah, mentally, I can't even imagine for those players, right? If you're Christopher Morel, knowing that you're talented enough to be on the big league team, but you're not there. Matt Mervis is the same circumstance, right? It's you're. If you're Matt Mervis, you are better than present day Eric Hosmer.
For sure.
And
yes.
That's just got to be so frustrating. And the fact that you stay mentally locked in and focused on the task at hand on a daily basis. Matt Mervis, Christopher Morel, both hitting home runs today for Iowa. Like
Mervis
that's
got one
amazing
too?
in itself. Matt hit one too.
That was he was over 2 and I looked.
Into the parking lot in Buffalo. Go back after we stop recording and watch the call by the visiting broadcast. Incredible. But yeah, it's that kind of aspect of prospectum. Oh, and I guess in Morel's case, like not even a prospect, right? Like he's not technically, him and Velasquez not technically prospects, but like we still look at those guys as like developing players.
Yeah, and Velasquez is a good example too. Like he came up. Well, one clear choice the Cubs made is they knew Seiya Suzuki was on the injured list to start the season. I think they had a pretty good idea. He'd maybe only miss a couple weeks, but when they made that decision, they opened the season with 2 outfielders on the roster. And that's a bold play and fans see that and they get frustrated. And on the one hand, you see Nelson Velasquez just crushing baseballs in AAA. You see Morel crushing baseballs in AAA, and he played outfield last year too. And then they also take a guy who I'm actually higher on, I think, than most people are, but Miles Mastrobuoni, I think can actually be a good productive player. And they basically made him a platoon right fielder, which is like the worst thing to do to him. And he just had to wear it.
Yeah, I mean, I talked about this quite a bit on Cubs on Deck, but if you'll allow me to go off on a little rant here,
sure.
I just think that the way that I've been really, really impressed by the way the front office and the coaching staffs have handled the development of certain players, especially on the pitching side of things, right? Mm-hmm. I think that like the way that they've handled Justin Steele and Keegan Thompson, Adbert Alzolay, guys like that in recent years is really, really impressive, and I'm really happy with the way they've handled some of that. With that being said, the way they've handled Nelson Velasquez in the last basically like calendar year now at this point has been so hurtful to his development, I'd imagine. Like it impacts him in such a negative way. I don't know, like maybe like they know their like the personalities and the players better than I do, right? Like they are in rooms with them every single day, and so I can't talk too like heavily negatively about this. But my thinking is that like we saw Nelson Velasquez in, I think it would have been late May of last year, early June.
Yeah, it was late May, right around
get
there.
Called up to the big leagues. And was essentially used as a fourth outfielder, a bench bat. He would start a couple times a week. He would come off the bench a few times a week. He would stay on the bench the entire game multiple times a week. Like it was just, he was not getting full season's worth of at bats. Which my thinking is, if you think that that's his ceiling, right, is as a fourth outfielder, then utilize him in that way right off the bat. That's totally fine.
Yes.
And so like in a vacuum, using him that way is fine if you continue to do that in future seasons. But this year we turn around, there's a very clear open spot for everyday at bats in Chicago with Seiya out, right? He could have been slotted into right field every single day. And whether he's performing well or performing poorly, he still gets to trot out there every single day to right field and work through some things and some development at the major league level. Instead, they send him down to AAA to get those like full seasons worth of at bats, like the everyday plate appearances, and you don't have an outfielder, a right fielder, like you just said. And it's like that's so backwards. Like last year, they should have kept him down at AAA for like all everyday at bats. And this year, they should have called him up to the big leagues for it. It's just they've handled it the opposite of the way that I would have handled it. I don't really get that, and I think that developmentally, like it just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it's weird in context too, right? Because I like that the Cubs have been searching for that Ben Zobrist since Ben retired, and maybe Mastrobuoni can be that guy. He can play a little outfield. He can play all over the infield. But there's a big difference between, hey, there's a real oddball matchup this week. We want to get as many lefties in the lineup as we can, so we're going to go ahead and eat the defense, and we're going to put Mastrobuoni in right field. Mm-hmm. Versus, hey, you're going to play there for the better part of 2 weeks until Seiya comes back. And like last year, it wouldn't have mattered so much. Last year, the Cubs were out of it early. So to your point, if they have Nelson Velasquez in AAA, find somebody like maybe a Darius Hill or somebody in AAA who you see as potentially being a future fourth outfielder.
Yeah.
Let them come up and get some time and let Nelson develop. But now it's a long season and it's hard to put too much stock in any one particular game. But like there was one specific game that probably the Cubs lost because Mastrobuoni couldn't come in and make a catch. That it's not so much his fault. A natural right fielder probably has those instincts to come in and get it. But this is a season now where that game might matter.
Yeah, I will say too that I think that David Ross actually does a pretty damn good job of like playing matchups appropriately. Both platoon lefty righty, but also Patrick Wisdom hitting against guys with fastball, or like playing the pitching matchup as well, like more than just like left versus right. I think David Ross does a really good job of that, and so because he does a really good job of that, I feel like they could have taken advantage of Nelson Velasquez being up in Chicago this year and not necessarily having to play him every single day, but playing him most days in right field, right? Like if the matchup doesn't feel right, then you play Miles Mastrobuoni in right field instead of Nelson
Wisdom
Velasquez.
or Mancini or whoever.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I actually really trust David Ross from that perspective of things.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the club, and I want to get back to talking about the roster decisions, I think they've made some very clear decisions. I think it was very clear. I had an episode of my own podcast in mid-December before they got Swanson, and it seemed like all the free agents were coming off the board. And it was like, come on, Jed, what's the plan? Well, it's pretty clear now what the plan is. I mean, it's pitching and it's defense, and they're trying to cut the K rate. And in that context, they've done a fantastic job. I mean, they are... But I think I saw they're leading the National League in runs per game. They're certainly scoring more than they have in the past. Their strikeout rates are down. Even guys like Hosmer, who are struggling, high contact guy. And I think part of the trade-off is we hear this team talk about, we hear people talk about the team as not having power. And I think in the classic sense, people hear power and they think home runs. But they're also, this team hits a lot of singles right now. And that is somewhat reliant on luck to a point. I mean, you can hit a hard ground ball. You hit something, 95 miles an hour plus. If you don't hit it right at a guy, it's probably getting through the infield. But then people look and see, and they've got Christopher Morel, Nelson Velasquez, Matt Mervis, just destroying baseballs in AAA. And knowing that's the one gap left on this team, I think I was looking through the numbers. Is Iowa's team particularly full of power at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, between guys like the guys we talked about, Mervis and Velasquez and Morel, I mean, they're driving up the power pretty significantly. And I think that what you just mentioned now with the high contact and like the way that they're assembling the team goes perfectly hand in hand with what we were just talking about a few minutes ago. It's like that high floor, right? When you're making a lot of contact, then by default, like you're going to have a high floor because good, quote unquote, good things happen when you put the ball in play, right? But you got to have a good mix, right? Like you got to have that mix of guys that are putting the ball in play, the Nikos, the Dansby this year, like to an extreme degree, which is, I mean, it's a different Dansby than we've seen in past years, but still really good. The Nick Madrigals, Trey Mancini is a guy that in the past has made a whole lot of contact. Eric Hosmer, like guys like that. But you got to pair those guys and choose the right ones, Nico and Dansby, right, with the guys with more power, Matt Mervis, Christopher Morel, and Nelson Velasquez. When you combine that, that's when you have like a super successful team. I think that baseball went in that direction where they were heavy power focused. Like extra base hits are king, they are everything. And then you saw the Cubs kind of make this trade very clearly. Like I think it was the Nick Madrigal trade really that really made me think, oh, like the Cubs are going for this style where it's like the high contact, like raise the floor, all that good stuff. But good teams are combining those. You incorporate 2 or 3 high contact guys with 2 or 3 big power guys, and then you have 2 or 3 of just like in between. And right now, the Cubs have a really high floor, but unfortunately, they have a really, really, really low ceiling. I'll give credit to Brendan Miller over the CHGO podcast because he has been beating the drum basically like since this offseason about this. How you have to give these guys that have a higher variance, right? The Matt Mervises and the Christopher Morels, like you have to give them an opportunity because that might be the difference in a couple games, right? You can still fall back on that floor, but for this Cubs team, that is not like they are going to be at its current form. They're going to be competing for a wild card. Like 1 or 2, 3 games, they matter drastically.
Yes.
You know, and so if Matt Mervis can go and win you a game, okay, I'll take that. If Christopher Morel, whether it's his power in terms of home run power or doubles or triples because he's fast too, or power in terms of arm strength and electric fielding in the field too, like if that can go win you a couple more games, that's 3 games. That's the difference in a wild card or out of the playoffs. You know.
Yeah. Well, and when you look at it, I think they have both on the hitting side and the pitching side. So the pitching side, I think the rotation's in pretty good shape right now. I think they're mostly pitching well. We'll see how Assad does tonight. But the bullpen, not a ton of swing and miss. And you look at that game that, Fulmer took way too much crap from fans, I think, for the blown save. But it was a fairly weak ground ball that got through. But again, like, if you have more guys who can get swing and miss, then you don't have those ground balls. Like you said, you put the ball in play, good things happen. Well, if you're pitching balls in play, bad things can happen. Yeah,
I think Michael Fulmer's a good pitcher. Like I think he's a good reliever. But I think if he has to be relied on to be your ninth inning guy or your big out guy, I think that like I've enjoyed looking at it that way as opposed to ninth inning. Like it's when you're facing the heart of the order in the eighth, whatever it might be. With runners on base especially, that wasn't the case for Fulmer the other night. But like if you're inheriting runners and stuff like that, getting Jeremiah Estrada in the game that he has when he's in the big league level, arguably the best fastball in the big leagues. Like I wouldn't say he does have the best one, but like I'd listen to an argument. I wouldn't call you crazy if you said he has the best fastball. And getting that swing and miss from Jeremiah Estrada is huge. And now I'm not saying Jeremiah Estrada can be called up and immediately thrust into those big outs. But I think it's important. And I think the Cubs have done a pretty job of that in years past, for the most part, in the bullpen. I think that they've done some reclamation project with some veteran relievers. They've been able to call up some relievers too. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of guys in the system right now that get that swing and miss stuff. The Cam Sanders of the world. And even like if you're looking past 1 inning guys, there's multi-inning relievers that are not too far off too. And that can be utilized at the big league level, kind of like what Steele was a few years ago or what Keegan's being used as now. Yeah. I loved watching Cam Sanders in spring training. He's fun. He's fun. He's fun. Not only is he like a good pitcher, but like he's an easy guy to root for because he has that swagger, man. He has that swagger big time. Well, like you said with Estrada, so he's, again, like Brendan Miller talks about, he's got that variance. Mm-hmm. Because some days he's going to come in, he's going to be overmatched, the moment's going to be bigger than he is, and it might go sideways. And again, trusting David Ross and trusting like how and I trust him a little bit less in his reliever decisions than I do in his lineup decisions, but like it's if you put your faith in your manager, then he will handle that situation the right way, right? Like there's going to be some clunkers every once in a while, but like I don't know. You just got to put some faith in your manager to a certain degree. So when I look at the roster, it's a 26-man roster, and I assume most of the year they're going to be 13 and 13 pitchers, 13 hitters. Mm-hmm. And if you figure, barring injury, we got Gomes, Barnhart, Horner, Swanson, Wisdom, Happ, Bellinger, Suzuki, and probably Mancini are basically non-negotiable. They're going to be there, which really leaves 4 spots. So when you start looking at the minor league level, there are only, you're maybe only talking 4 to 6 guys potentially in play as they rotate through those 4 spots. And then that's also assuming, I've got Madrigal as a maybe. The more he hits, the more likely he is to stay. They seem to like him. Who knows with Rios, if he starts hitting the ball, crushing baseballs, he might stick. But I think the big one that's getting the attention right now is that Hosmer Mervis. I mean, I put out a podcast yesterday and I talked a lot about, I dug into Hosmer's numbers, and as bad as he's hitting lucky. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. His contact is so weak. It's all on the ground. I couldn't believe when I saw he had a negative 4.7 average launch angle. It's almost impossible. Like you almost can't even try to do that. Nobody else on the team, I don't think is less than 3. Yeah. That's the clear cut. That's the clear cut like change in roster that makes a big difference, right? Is sliding Matt Mervis in, sliding Eric Hosmer out, and really when you're making moves like that too, it lengthens your roster. Like for example, if you're calling up Christopher Morel, honestly, Nick Madrigal is playing probably an appropriate amount, maybe a little bit. I mean, I don't know. Like, I think that you're not utilizing Nick Madrigal as a starter, obviously, and that's not how he's being utilized mostly at this point. But like, if you're bringing up guys with higher variance, like Christopher Morel, then you can have those safer guys like the Miles Mastrobonis on your bench, utilized in a true like utility role. You know.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe when you get those guys, when I think tomorrow the Cubs are going to face Urias for the Dodgers, high K guy, maybe you do get Madrigal in there because you want to make sure you get some balls in play.
Playing those matchups, 100%.
Yeah. But with Hosmer, I mean, coming into the season, I know why they signed him. They hadn't signed Mancini yet, so I think that was still in question. It gave them some stability at first base. But once you had both, I kind of felt like Hosmer was going to get about 6 weeks. But now the way he's playing and the way Mervis is playing, I hope that decision window tightens up.
It just feels like early May is the move. I think Brian brought it up on our pod. I don't know if he brought it up on the podcast or if he brought it up in a tweet immediately. I think it was a tweet immediately following our pod. Like, we recorded the podcast and then we were talking about when Matt Mervis might get called up, and we didn't have the schedule in front of us, and then we stopped recording, and I checked Twitter, and Brian had tweeted about when he expected Mervis to get called up. And I think it's that first week in May that the Cubs play in DC against the Nationals.
Okay.
And Mervis being from around the area, that feels right. Cubs like calling up guys on the road so that they're not coming to Wrigley Field for their first home game, and it's Wrigley in addition to everything that goes with making your MLB debut. So I don't know, man. It feels like Mervis debuting in Washington makes a lot of sense, and I think that timeline matches up pretty well. I like that. I'm rolling with that prediction too.
Excellent. Yeah, I hope to see it, because that's also so Mervis is a good case too, because you also have the 40-man roster complication.
Yeah.
Morel can bounce up and down. That's fine. He could swap places with Madrigal and switch back in another 2 weeks. And I think this is part of, you guys talked about this too, I think, where there are kind of stages in the season. You don't want to overreact. Even right now, Trey Mancini is probably pushing 50 plate appearances. I don't have the number in front of me. He's been awful, but he's done enough in the past that I think we're still in small sample size. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't feel that way with Hosmer. This is kind of how he fizzled at the end of last year. This is kind of why the Padres let him go. Yeah. And Mancini does have that power profile that he can bring back if he gets that back going. And so when you look at this, it does seem 40, 50 games seems to be a point where you might kind of reassess and make decisions, although hopefully the Hosmer thing pushes faster. But if you're going to bring someone like Mervis up, you're making a decision on someone else, and while they may clear waivers and you might pull them back into the minor leagues, you're effectively deciding, okay, we're done with this guy. Mm-hmm. And the Cubs have shown they'll do that, so I'm not worried about that long term. The question is, how long do they... it didn't matter last year when they rolled for too long with Jonathan VR or some of those other guys. But now it does matter.
It does, and I worry a little bit about there is value in clubhouse presence and all that good stuff, and I know that David Ross values that to an extreme amount, so I'm a little worried about that might delay the inevitable with Eric Hosmer. Mm-hmm. But from a roster construction standpoint, let's look at a lineup, right? Where right now you've got a top of the order of Nico Horner and Dansby Swanson and Ian Happ. And then if you have Cody Bellinger in there right after them, who's been very, very good, those guys are getting on base. And the guys, the top two in the order, they're getting on base and basically by way of singles, right? You put Matt Mervis in the 5-hole or in the 6-hole, even in the 6-hole, right? If you're surrounded in a lineup with guys that are getting on first base, and then they're walking, Ian Happ walks a ton, and so if you're surrounding yourself with those guys, Matt Mervis just pops one double every once in a while, and you're looking pretty solid. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's where the power, that we're talking about power. That's where that comes into play, is when you're surrounding by guys that are getting on by singles, and then all of a sudden you can drive a guy in from first base with Matt Mervis, even if it's not a home run. It doesn't need to be a home run. It can be a double. It can be a ball put in the gap. that makes a big difference in lineup construction, right? And right now you don't see that variance in the lineup construction.
Yeah, and I think there's also like I really noticed it when Seiya came back, like that. Even just putting Seiya back in the lineup makes that lineup so much deeper.
Yeah.
And in terms of guys the pitcher has to worry about, even though Mervis will be a rookie when he first comes up, and I don't know how much the other teams will know about him. I mean, everybody's got scouting reports, but he's a guy you have to worry about. Eric Hosmer, if you make a mistake pitch, maybe he hits a gap double.
Mm-hmm.
That's about the worst he's going to do.
Yeah.
Although I did love, I posted that podcast yesterday where I kind of ripped him, and then he hit a home run right after I published.
I know.
So
It was a good timing on that one.
But the more they can deepen that lineup with the variance guys, Mervis might be a strikeout machine when he comes up for a while.
Yeah,
because big league pitching is hard. But
yeah, we talked about that on the show on Cubs on Deck too, right? Brian and I talked about how it's going to be different for Mervis, right, when he gets called up, because right now, like he is the best hitter in AAA. I mean, like he's not stat wise. There's guys, but like he is one of the most feared hitters in AAA, and pitchers are just pitching around him. I know that Aram Layton, who does really good work for the Call Up Pod, he's over at Just Baseball. Like he had the numbers that I do not have regarding the number of pitches that Matt Mervis is seeing in the zone versus out of the zone, the amount he's swinging, all that good stuff, and it's pitchers are avoiding him at all costs, and I would be too if I was a AAA pitcher.
Yeah.
You know, big league pitchers won't do that. Like they're going to attack him. He'll have some success early on, I'm sure. Brian pointed out that like it's that next wave. It's once the pitchers do figure him out at the big league level, then how does Matt Mervis adjust? And he's been able to adjust at every level he goes to. He had to experience that a lot last year, where he bounced to 3 different levels. So like he's able to succeed, come back down to earth, and then succeed again after he figures out what pitchers are trying to do to get him out. I don't know, man. I think that like he will see the strikeout rate increase. He will see the walk rate significantly. I think you'll see a bigger effect or a bigger impact on his walk rate lowering than his strikeout. I think his strikeout rate will increase, but I think his walk rate is going to go way down, especially for the first few like couple months or so that he's in the big leagues. And that's not a bad thing necessarily.
No,
it's just it's going to happen.
Pitchers are going to go after him as opposed to pitching around him.
Yeah.
There's no way you're going to pitch around him to go face Patrick Wisdom or whoever is going to be behind him.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's a big difference with when I look at Matt Mervis. I don't know at this point, now that he's shown he came back and started this season exactly like he ended the last season, I don't know what he's getting, what's making him better right now. Because to your point, he's not getting challenged. The AAA pitchers don't have a hole in the swing that they can go exploit. That will happen at some point in the bigs.
Yeah. Development continues to the big league level, and like, it's time. It's time. You know, like I think that like we talk about that way more with pitchers. How development just always continues, and it's way more apparent there. But it always continues for hitters too. Like I think that came up a whole lot more in the conversations about Morel last year. But at some point, you're done with the adjustments. You're done with the development at a certain level, and I think Mervis is at that level with AAA. I think at this point, he's not learning enough about AAA pitchers to overcompensate for the message that he's being sent by being kept down in AAA, and how that impacts his development. You know what I mean? Like you got to balance that, and I don't think he's learning much from facing AAA pitchers anymore.
Yeah. Well, on the flip side, you led me to my next guy is Morel. We saw him come up last year, and I don't know what the actual plan was, but I assume when they called Morel up, they thought, hey, this guy's going to come up. We'll get him a little exposure. He'll spend a couple weeks here, and he'll go back to AAA, because he was killing it in AA. I think he had didn't he end 2021 in AAA, but got like 8 games in or something at the end of the year.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, he gets on base in 23 straight games to start his career, and with the energy and the fact that people actually wanted to buy a ticket to come watch him play, he just stuck when probably he shouldn't have, because we did see. I mean, by the end of the season, he was striking out close to 40% of the time, and so when it made sense to me to go ahead if they see him as a potential star, and I think I think most of us do. I'll get your opinion on it in a second. But if you think he's going to be a 10-year major leaguer, cutting that K rate is probably essential.
Yeah, I think it is. Cutting the K rate to, I don't think he needs to cut it down to even like 25%. So I don't think that's even necessary. I just think that he needs to keep it around the 30% threshold.
Yeah, with his power.
Yeah, exactly. And it's everything else he brings to the table. I mean, as far as like the star comment, I think I might have talked with you about this on your show. I've talked about it with people before, but with Morel, like, do you consider Chris Taylor to be a star? Right? No. Like that's what I want. That is desperately what I want from Christopher Morel. And I know that people want more from him, and I know that like I've maintained that assessment. If we can get Chris Taylor out of Christopher Morel, then it's a success.
Absolutely.
And it may not be a star, and I think that like with the super high exit velos and the cannon strapped to his right arm and the speed that he displays and the way that he goes about playing the game of baseball, I think you want to like put a star label on him. And I think that because he does all those things that way, he can perform at Chris Taylor's level and still be considered more of a star than Chris Taylor is because of all the things he does that like just catch your eye. You know, like he could put up identical numbers. Like I don't have Chris Taylor's like strikeout and walk numbers in front of me, but like he could put up identical numbers across the board as Chris Taylor, and Christopher Morel would be more of a star than Chris Taylor because of everything else that he brings to the table, you know? But yeah, I maintain that. I stick with, if he can be Chris Taylor, I'm very happy. If he can be less than Chris Taylor, I probably still will be happy because Chris Taylor's a damn good Major League Baseball player.
Well, I think it's very easy to watch. You know, anybody who follows the prospects, and some people don't, which is fine. But if you follow them up, you see them, you know, if a guy's going to be a major leaguer, he's probably a star in A-ball. He's probably a star in AA. He's probably a really good player at AAA. It is really, really freaking hard to be a good major league player and stick for years.
Yeah.
So the idea that some guy seems disappointing is a little bit, it's frustrating for me sometimes because sometimes I can see, well, this guy is a very good, solid Patrick Wisdom. I mean, he's red hot right now. But he got a lot of criticism last year, but he is legitimately a major league hitter. Mm-hmm. And pick your spots. I thought coming into the season maybe more like a platoon against lefties and certain righties. But he's clearly made some improvements, so maybe he's a little bit above that now.
And again, it's back to what you were saying in the beginning, right? Where there are players that are stars, there are players that are regulars, there are players that are bench guys, and they all bring value to your team. There's guys that get traded away before they hit it big or before they fizzle out. And they bring value to your organization in a variety of different ways. And just because a guy is in high A and not a star at high A does not mean you stop worrying about their development, right? If you can still like develop them into a depth piece, like if it's a pitcher that you think like this guy might not be anything, well, it's like if you can fix him up and continue to get him to improve to the point where he is just AAA depth for the major league team, that brings value to your organization, right? Like that's we talk. I feel like we talk about that every year going into opening day. It's like, oh, what does the rotation depth look like just in case 12 guys get injured? You know, like it's right. You go to these like just off the wall type of like scenarios that probably won't play out, but like you always talk about rotation depth and how necessary that is. Well, it's like pitcher like those rotation depth, like that rotation depth. A lot of times that comes from a guy that is not all that impressive at high A, like not flashing the radar gun, not making you say wow when you watch him pitch. It's like he just kind of chugs along and continues on with his development. And next thing you know, he's a middle of the rotation starter in Iowa. That has value, like it or not.
Javier Assad.
Exactly. Javier Assad's a perfect example of that.
Well, I can make a good argument too, going back to the 2015, 2016 Cubs teams, for all the star power for KB and Rizzo and Baez and John Lester and peak Kyle Hendricks and all that. They probably don't win the World Series without Chris Coughlin and Tommy La Stella and Travis Wood. Like you just need those guys to advance the order and be on base when the big sluggers hit their thing, or get the game to the top end relievers in the pen, or get through that 4 or 5 starter hole.
Yeah. And Tommy La Stella wasn't even on the World Series roster, right? He got pushed off the roster for Kyle Schwarber.
I believe that's true. Yeah.
And it's like, think about that. Like Tommy La Stella, like very, very polarizing guy for the role that he's been on several teams, which is kind of funny. But like, think about Tommy La Stella and like he again, like Patrick Wisdom, he's a legitimate big league player, right? He's had some downturns in what he does at the plate, but like it's hard to argue with like what he ended up doing in his big league career, and he didn't even make the World Series roster. It's like that is depth. That is depth right there.
That's it, yeah, for sure. And so I guess move to the pitching side a little bit. So I think the rotation's pretty locked in. We've got you should have eight to 10 starters. I think the Cubs actually have that. I haven't followed. How has Adrian Sampson been pitching in AAA? I know he struggled early.
Yeah, not great. Not great from Adrian Sampson. Yeah, he was the opening day starter for Iowa, and which makes sense. I think that it was good to see him kind of stick around the organization again for depth. But really, Caleb Killian has been the guy that's kind of turned it on the past couple outings. But the rotation at Iowa, while I think that like there's guys in that rotation that could give a spot start in Chicago throughout the season, none of them are guys that you want as like consistent number 5 starters at this point in Chicago. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you think we'll see Killian up this year?
Yeah, I think so. I think given the fact that he's already been to Chicago, given the fact that he's a little bit older for a prospect, already on the 40-man roster, obviously, I think that there's a lot of different things that get thrown into the equation that, like, yeah, I think we've seen back in Chicago. I don't see a scenario where he is a long-term starter in Chicago. It would be for a few starts here and there.
Okay.
But I'm probably I'm one of the lowest people on, as far as like prospect followers, I'm one of the lowest people on Caleb Killian, I'd say. So, yeah.
So I guess my next question is kind of with the rise of Hayden Wesneski at the end of last year. In some sense, it hurts Caleb Killian, but Killian was the guy that everybody was so excited to see last year. Like, when's he going to come up? When's he going to start? And he made that good start against St. Louis. And then like his whole world just fell apart, lost all of his command and struggled even going back down to Iowa. I kind of wonder if Hayden Wesneski maybe took some of the pressure off Killian. Puts pressure on because now Hayden just kind of took his spot, but he's not getting all the attention anymore.
It definitely breeds competition, right? Like it's like these guys are like addicts to competition, right? Like
yes.
like they have to be competing, and not that like Killian didn't have other people to be competing against in the past couple of years, but now it's definitely there because not only is Hayden Wesneski up in the rotation in Chicago, but you have another guy in Riley Thompson that's really starting to show out in AAA, and then you have a stacked rotation in right behind Caleb Killian in AA, right? Yes. You got the Jordan Wicks and Ben Browns and Ryan Jensen's and Daniel Palenci's, like those guys are right behind him, and so like. It kind of creates a sense of urgency, in addition to like in terms of like timeline, but like pressure to succeed, and I think that can only be a good thing, right? I think that can only be a good thing, and I don't know how Caleb Killian ticks in between his ears, but I'd imagine that's probably a really good thing for making him push forward and be the best version of himself.
Yeah, well, that was one thing when I talked to David Da Silva, one of the Cubs mental skills coaches, about one of the things they have to constantly work with these guys in is you're in A-ball. Everybody thinks they're a major leaguer. But to get there, you're fighting like your best buddy that you love to hang out and hang out with after games might be your top competition to move to AA.
Yeah. It's that it goes back to the Max Bain thing where like you're just competing against everybody. Yeah. You're competing. I mean, you have 180 guys in your organization, but every organization has that, and you're competing within your organization to make it to your major league team, and also your buddies that you're playing with now, or your buddies that you played with in college against that are now facing off against you in AA, to play for their team maybe. You know, that's I don't envy that job of the coaching staffs that are required that are like working with these players to kind of get that through to them. You know. Yeah.
And so I was looking at let's move on to the pitching. So looking at the stats on Northside Bound, I love this that you guys have this updating every day now.
Yeah.
Thinking about power, you want those power arms, you want that swing and miss. And when I look, the 3 arms that really pop off are Anthony Kay. Surprisingly, he seems to be off to a really good start, and then obviously Estrada and Cam Sanders we've already talked about a little bit, and then maybe even Vinny Natoli to a smaller extent. I assume that at some point the Iowa-Chicago shuttle is going to get going. We'll probably start seeing some of those guys. Estrada's already on the 40-man, so that's easy. I think he made the West Coast trip with them, didn't?
Yeah, I believe so.
I heard he at least started out there.
Yeah, he was on the taxi squad. Yeah.
And I think those guys, especially the way, well, we'll see how Ross runs the bullpen, but you can get them looks in the 6th or 7th inning of a tight game and start to see how it goes. Like that's what he did with Thompson and Steele. Mm-hmm. And then as they show they can handle it, Brandon Hughes last year is a good example. Like he came in and let's just get you some innings and then do more and more. And all of a sudden he's like the best guy in the pen.
Yeah.
It would be fun to get some of that swing and miss up in Chicago.
I don't know if you said his name. Nick Birdie though is a guy that I would love to see in Chicago. Nick Birdie has been very, very good for AAA in terms of like generating lots of swings and misses. The stuff is nasty. Everything in terms of like the ERA and like anything related to that is not. I'm not paying attention to. Like Nick Birdie has an 8.1 ERA right now.
Yeah. But he's probably thrown 4 innings. So
yeah, exactly. All these guys are like you got to be careful about ERA for bullpen guys, regardless.
Yes.
But especially 3 weeks into the season. But just the stuff looks really, really good. Like that's true swing and miss stuff. His fastball, his slider. For Nick Birdie, it's always been about just staying healthy, which he has not been able to stay healthy. He's 30 years old now, and just hasn't been able to stay healthy throughout his entire career. So the fact that he's showing this swing and miss stuff, like 101 mile an hour fastballs in the AAA bullpen, like that's a guy that I expect to see in Chicago this year. Vinny Natoli is a guy that's getting a lot of swings and misses, a lot of called strikes. That's another guy that is like he does something weird, right? Like he throws the ball weird. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to me on Cubs on Deck, like I heavily emphasize that I dig guys that do weird stuff.
Yes.
I think that like just giving hitters a different look is so important. Vinny Natoli does that. Nick Birdie does that to a certain degree. It's Ryan Barucki, who's in another like kind of quad A guy, is a little bit wonky too. Yeah, so it's just I think there's a lot of swing and miss type guys. I'm looking at I'm kind of sorting on Northside Bound by the CSW percent, which is the called and swinging strikes combined. And there's a lot of Iowa guys up there at the top of the list, right? Mm-hmm. Natoli's up there, Birdie's up there, Barucki's up there. So you're seeing guys that are generating that swing, and that's not even to mention Cam Sanders, who's a little bit further down that list, but we know has swing and miss stuff.
Yes.
So it's there ready to come up to the big leagues whenever it's needed.
Well, and then when you look, like we walk through the offense, we can walk through the pitching staff. I think the rotation's in pretty good shape. I think in the bullpen, I think Michael Fulmer, Boxberger, Alzolay, Thompson, Hughes, and I tweeted earlier this week that I was just wrong on Mark Leiter Jr. I mean, the end of last season, he was getting it done in the bullpen, but I don't know. He's 30 whatever years old. Not a great track record, and he's doing okay. But like I would rather see Estrada or Cam Sanders or Manny Rodriguez. Like, but the more I see, like he's just getting it done, and the Cubs have been really good about. To your point, when you were talking about Nick Birdie, those guys who are 25 or not 25, 26, they're 30, 31, 32, but they have gas in the tank. They've done a really good job with those guys. Yeah,
I'm actually willing to be way more patient on bullpen arms than like I talked about like Matt Mervis, it's time. Like Christopher Morel, it's probably time. But bullpen guys, I'm actually. It depends a little bit because there's we don't really know about some opt-outs in contracts.
That's true.
Written into contracts for guys that are in AAA. Some of those like minor league, major league vets that are on minor league deals. A lot of guys have opt-outs on May 1st. Some guys have opt-outs on June 1st. Honestly, I don't know when some of those are for some of these players. I imagine that a guy like Anthony Kay or a guy like Tyler Duffy, like I'm sure they have those. I'm not saying that based on I'm not reporting anything. I can't imagine they don't have those. And so that throws a wrench into it a little bit. But as long as there's not a ton of dudes that have that opt out, I'm very content with just like riding out until you absolutely need a guy, or if there's an injury up at the big league level, right?
Yep.
If someone's looking really bad or someone gets injured, then you call up Nick Birdie. If something else happens to Boxberger or Leiter or something, then you call up Natoli. Then you call up Estrada. Then there's guys, you bring them up when necessary. Like that's where the depth of the system really shows itself, is the bullpen. When you can keep calling up a guy and like your fifth guy out of the bullpen in Chicago after there's already been 4 injuries is still successful. Like that, and I think that is actually I think Cubs development has done the single best job of doing over the past 5 years or so, 4 years or so. Is the bullpen. I really can't say a single negative thing about what they've done as far as bullpen depth, bullpen successes, veteran guys, young guys, all that good stuff. And we forget, like, Ben Leeper is another guy that should have been here in AAA, right? Ben Leeper went down with another arm injury, and that is super, super unfortunate. But like, he's another guy that would have been knocking, like, he in the Jeremiah Estrada category of like electric fastball, really good slider, and is like ready for Chicago yesterday.
What's his outlook on that injury? I saw that it happened.
I think that he's out for the year this year. And then we'll have to see from there. I've heard some things, but I don't want to report some stuff because I think that we'll just have to see with him. But it's so hard. It's not great. Yeah.
My oldest was a pitcher, and we were lucky to find a pitcher here who had been, I think he got as high as AA with the Nationals, and he good pitching coach and all, but he's like 25, and he had another arm injury and decided, you know what, I just have to go start my life and go.
It sucks, man. And especially with a guy like you look at Leeper, who is like so close to the big leagues. Like he should have been up in Chicago in 2021. That should have happened. And then he had a weird season last year where the overall numbers didn't match like what was going on under the hood. And so, like, if you look at that, like, he had a chance last year, and then he was going to make an appearance in Chicago this year, and it's like, crap. Like, I hate that, and I hate that for these guys.
Yeah. Well, and so on the reliever side, if we play that roster game, I think really the only couple spots really in play right now, but there'll be injuries, and guys will get tired, and they'll, have a big run and use the bullpen a lot. Guys will get shift back and forth, but, like, Rucker and Merriweather are probably the big questions. I've clearly not been as high on Rucker as the Cubs have been, but he is pitching better lately. And then I think Merriweather's just a guy they want to probably use that, 30, 40 games and find out.
Yeah. I kind of dig Rucker. He's
growing on me.
I know this is the CubsPS Plus podcast and look at some stats and stuff like that, but like I'm not using stats to back this up. I don't have his numbers up. I just kind of dig Mike Rucker, man. I don't know. I think that, like, I dig him in the bullpen. But Merriweather, I'd be okay with exchanging an Estrada for Merriweather or Anthony Kay for Merriweather. Give some. But the thing is, I was actually going to say, like, bring up, like, Anthony Kay as a lefty to give Brandon Hughes some help. But, like, we've seen Mark Leiter Jr. is that lefty killer, right? Like, that splitter kills lefties, and it's terrific.
He made Freddie Freeman look silly last week.
Yeah, exactly. Like having Mark Leiter is basically like having another lefty in your bullpen, which is terrific. And he's been so good. He's been very, very good. But yeah, I think that like that you mentioned, like Merriweather and Rucker are your two examples, and Rucker has options, I believe.
I think he does. Yeah.
Merriweather does.
He does not.
Yeah, so you'd have to move on from Merriweather, but you have the convenience of being able to do that, right? Like you can move on from Merriweather. And like we said, there's all these guys in Iowa that are ready to come up to the big leagues, and you still have that depth. And even like going further down than Iowa, like you got guys like Bailey Horn, who has been like he's a legitimate relief pitcher prospect. And then like the Ryan Jensens and Ben Browns, like those two guys are on the 40-man roster, are guys that could be a couple inning relievers in the big leagues later this year. So yeah, there's relief depth. Aplenty.
On the offensive side, looking past Iowa, is there anybody you see at the AA level who might potentially make a splash later this year?
Besides PCA?
Yeah. Besides the obvious.
Yeah, I mean...
Although with Bellinger there, I don't know that they would call him up. I think
No, I think that I think we'll see PCA this year. I think we will. Now, how or why or when? That's I don't know the answer to that. But I think that PCA is going to be too good in the minor leagues to not call him up. I think PCA is your starting center fielder in Chicago come 2024 opening day.
Yes.
And so because of that, I think you do your best to get him acclimated in some degree to Chicago this year. So that's something to consider.
If Bellinger has an injury, maybe he's the one up.
Yeah, or if Bellinger flips and goes back to a couple of years past Bellinger or something, or if we see the Cubs start to really struggle and they trade Bellinger at the deadline. There's a lot that can happen between now and like when it's actually time. Like now is not time to call up PCA. It's like it's later. There's not going to be like a Christopher Morel situation where you're calling up a guy early in the year from AA. I can't imagine. I guess I got two guys. One is Chase Strumpf, who is not on the 40-man roster. And it feels like Jake Slaughter is kind of past Chase Strumpf a little bit in the depth chart in terms of like second baseman, third baseman, like that position group. But I think that like this is a big year for Chase Strumpf in terms of like I'm expecting big things from him, but like in terms of like his career path. Because I think that if he stays the entire year in AA, I think that we probably see him in a different organization come next year potentially. And so if he performs well, we talk about like a volatile type player. Chase Strumpf is that, right? Like he puts up like overall the numbers overall are good, right? The overall production. Like you look at his bash on Northside bound, he has good production. If you look at his overall like OPS numbers, they're good. It's just has a low batting average and he strikes out a lot and he walks a lot and he's the true outcome type guy.
Yeah.
But that still has value, and so I think there's a potential that we see him later, especially because he plays both second and third, which are I know we got Nico at second base obviously, but third base is not really like locked in, even with Patrick Wisdom playing well, because he can see some time in the outfield and stuff like that. So. Yep. Chase Strumpf is a guy off the 40-man roster on the offensive side. A guy on the 40-man roster I want to bring up because I don't know how likely it is we see him in Chicago this year, if at all, but he's on the 40-man roster. Miguel Amaya is performing really well early on.
And people forget he's only 24.
Yeah, I feel like we probably wrote him off too soon because of the injury. And when you have Tommy John surgery and you have some injury problems, like I get writing him off. Like, it makes sense. That's fine. But when he came back last year and looked pretty smooth at the plate, right? Like he looked a lot better than he's looked in past years. This year he's looked really good at the plate. Still good behind the plate now. I don't know. I don't think it's out of question we see him in Chicago this year. I'd be, how do I phrase it? I'd be surprised at this point. I'd be surprised if we saw him in Chicago. But like if he keeps doing this, and we know like right now the Cubs love using three catchers. Right. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him kind of like how Wilson Contreras was called up in 2016. Right. He was called up, if I remember right, in June.
I think that's right.
And
he was up and down for a while. Like they'd use him for a couple series and.
Yeah. And that was, they kind of eased him. I think catcher is the position where you can really ease somebody into the process. And I wouldn't be surprised to see like maybe Miguel Amaya gets that treatment, right? Where he gets called up midseason and is the third catcher with Luis Torrens gone. And you got Jan Gomes and Tucker Barnhart, who are very veteran guys. And Miguel Amaya being around those guys, you can do a whole lot worse than that, right? Like getting that experience is good. So
for sure.
I'll throw his name out there.
Cool. We're getting towards the back end. I don't want to dive in too deep, but I do want to talk about with the new stats you've got going at Northside Bound that refresh every day. You also developed a new metric. I want to talk a little bit about Bash.
Yeah.
What got that started in your head?
So actually, I think your show when I came on the first time was the first time I like dropped a hint that was coming, didn't I? Or did I just like talk to you off air? Or
you
something
did
like
tell
that?
me you were working on something. Didn't have a name. Yeah.
And that was the first time I mentioned it at all. So you heard it here first, folks. No, I in past years, in recent seasons, it had become increasingly difficult to understand age in comparison to level and what that meant for players' production and what their outlook on major league production looked like. because we lost that short season affiliate. And so the low A level especially became really, really difficult to understand because, and still today, right? Still right now, you got guys like Cade Horton who pitched in the Big 12 facing off against guys like Christian Hernandez who are 19 years old, their second season being in the United States.
Right.
Very different types of players, right? And so it became very difficult to understand like what we were looking at. So I kept looking at like WRC Plus, which WRC Plus is a terrific stat. I've utilized that a lot, but what WRC Plus does not take into account are three different things. They don't look at stolen bases. They don't look at like how you run the bases. It doesn't look at ballpark factors, which is wild that it doesn't. It looks for league adjustments, which is terrific. Which Bash does do that too, but WRC Plus does not look at ballpark factors. And we know like Myrtle Beach is a pitcher's heaven. Competition they're playing against. So I wanted to create a stat, kind of an all-encompassing stat that looks a lot like WRC Plus, where 100 is perfectly average, but incorporate those three things that WRC Plus does not take into account. So the output is Bash, and in that it's a little less crazy in terms of like a guy that performs super, super well on WRC Plus, like they could have a WRC Plus of like 150 to 180, right, for over the course of an entire season. That will not happen with Bash. Basically anything above like 130 is like elite level production.
Okay.
I'd have to pull up last year's numbers, but like Matt Mervis was actually not. I don't think he was a leader in the clubhouse with Bash last year. I'd have to go back and look, but
might have been Canario.
I think it was Canario. I think that the PCA was obviously up there too because he spent quite a bit of time in Myrtle Beach too, so that helps. But yeah, so basically the point of Bash is just to be able to kind of look at the entire system as a whole and see not only, hey, how well did that guy perform this year, but what does that mean for his production and his like prospect status long term, right? So like a guy like last year, we saw Jake Slaughter was really, really impressive last year. Offensively, you look at his number, you look at his slash line, his stolen bases, his home run total, like all that good stuff was really, really impressive. And so he was helped in Bash over WRC Plus because he had stolen bases.
Okay.
So that helped him. But he was also hurt a little bit because he was pretty significantly older than league average, especially when he was at South Bend. Like he was 24, 25 years old, playing against guys where the average age was like closer to like 22, 23. So that really affected his Bash, and that went down a little bit. So versus guys that are like super young, like Christian Hernandez really benefits from playing at low A right now. Like it shouldn't hurt him that he's younger than average,
right.
Average age, you know. And in Bash, it really helps him that he's younger than average age. So, yeah, long-winded answer of saying it's just kind of an all-encompassing number that you can kind of look at and kind of judge and kind of critique and all that good stuff of prospects over the course of the season.
And to your point, I think it's going to be really helpful because I know some of the things about the system. I knew Myrtle Beach. I mean, the way those winds come in, it's definitely a pitcher's park. But to be able to look and see, well, okay, I see the guys hitting 250 with a 720 OPS. That doesn't look as flashy as this other guy. But then you lose sight of the fact that, you know, it might be a 27-year-old playing AA. And that's different than a 22-year-old playing AAA.
Yeah, and I think too that it helps with the ballpark factors. Like you mentioned Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach plays in a really tough league for hitting. And so like they were helped by looking at like WRC Plus and OPS Plus and stuff like that. But then you take into account that it's like not only is it the league, but it's the ballpark too. Especially for that league, the ballpark is tough to hit in. So like Myrtle Beach players probably love looking at Bash scores.
What about, do you factor K rate into Bash?
No, I don't factor K rate and walk rate.
Okay.
That's something that I kind of want to in a future version of.
I could see doing
Bash.
it, and I could see not doing it. So
yeah, like right now, like
because that would hurt Owen Casey.
Yeah, right. Like Owen Casey right now is the leader in Bash in the system. He has a 162 Bash. I know I just said that 130 is elite, so that's how good that Owen Casey's been in a very small sample size. But Owen Casey's the leader at 162. He is striking out an incredible amount, right? Like
Isn't that 57%?
57% strikeout rate, 6% walk rate. So like he's not doing either of these things like well.
He's gonna have to cut that down.
Yeah, and so like that, in future versions of Bash where I do incorporate strikeout rate, walk rate is kind of taken into account because I do account for like walks. I a lot like what WOBA does.
Yeah.
I kind of take into account like run values for getting on base. So strikeout rate is not accounted for. Walk rate essentially is accounted for.
And strikeouts matter and they don't. I mean, you're going to get your outs somewhere.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like Owen Casey's not going to get promoted to the bigs with a 57% K rate in AA.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is great. Well, thanks for coming on. I would love to catch up again later this season. The end of the season, let's do an episode on Bash and see how it performed in its debut year.
I'd love to. Yeah, I was going to say, this is the debut year of it. So I was able to like run the numbers for the last season after the season, obviously. So we saw that. But this is the first season where we're like seeing it all like happen live. And like, I'm a little nervous. Like I trust in the stat. Like I run the numbers a whole lot to get to this place. But like, I'm just curious to see how it progresses throughout the season. And especially as guys climb up the ladder, right? Like, cause it changes as a guy goes from high A, gets promoted to AA. So like those numbers tweak. As it gets even younger for his level and stuff like that. So,
that's a question I had actually. So, whoever is going to be this year's Matt Mervis that's going to go and play 3 levels, is as we look at Bash as the season goes, is there going to be one cumulative score that factors in what they did at A and what they did at AA and what they did at AAA?
Yes, that's actually super easy to explain on that one. So yeah, a guy gets a Bash score for each affiliate that he plays at, and then it gets altered based on the number of plate appearances that he took at each level, right? So if say Owen Case is a bad example. Say Moises Ballesteros in low A ends up playing 80%, getting 80% of his plate appearances in low A, and then at the end of the season he gets called up and 20% of his plate appearances come in high A. Well, that's adjusted to that level, right? So like it's not just like he gets 50% of his plate appearances at both levels. It's like it's adjusted based on how many plate appearances he got at each level.
But when I see that number, I'm seeing that's their score for the year so far, regardless of where they've played and how many levels.
Yeah. So on Northside Bound, what you'll see, I'll see the back end levels for each affiliate, but what you'll see on Northside Bound is the like overall numbers throughout each level, except like a guy like Nelson Velasquez, you're not getting his major league numbers on this because, and the reason is because at the major league level, this doesn't really pertain to that because it is. There, you have nowhere else to go. I kind of keep hitting on like the age and how important age is on this, and obviously age is important. Like younger guys are better. Like it's better if you're performing well at a younger age at the major league level. But like there's nowhere else for you to go above that. So like I don't care if you're 25 and performing really well at the major league level or 35. Like just do it. Like for this season, just do it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So those numbers at the major league level are not taken into account.
I saw a great thing. Some baseball writer, I wish I could remember who did it, but they were talking about kind of the quad A guys that, you know, you're almost a major leaguer, you're not, you're a starter. And then you get like prime Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani, Pujols back in the day, like these like 75A. Like,
yeah.
There's just, you get to the bigs and there's no more gradation.
It's, I don't care how good you are, you got to go out in there and compete, right? Like, I don't care if you're that quad A guy. I don't care if you're 30-year-old Nick Birdie coming up to the big leagues for the first time in years. You were a minor league Rule 5 draft pick. Guess what? You might get to face Shohei Ohtani that day. You might get to face Mike Trout. Like, you got to compete. That's a wild aspect of baseball.
Yes. Speaking of Shohei, are the Cubs going to trade for him?
No. Did you see I tweeted something about it today?
I did not, actually. I saw the report out.
Yeah, so I saw the report that's like, oh, like the Cubs might be interested, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, all right, just for fun, let's see what like a trade package for Shohei Ohtani. And so like basically I went off of Juan Soto's trade package last year and then scaled it way down because Soto still had like what 3.5 years or two and a half,
something like
2.5 years of team control. So like it had to be scaled down because Shohei is a true rental. But also you got to scale it back up a little bit because Shohei is more valuable than what Juan Soto is. Sure. And so I think I started, when I tweeted out was a package of, I think it was PCA, Wesneski, and Ballesteros. And that got so many comments on it, man. I was just like, I don't think the Cubs are going to do it. But I was like, think about this, folks. Like this is what like the Cubs would have to give up for Shohei Ohtani. And I said at least, right? Like it would probably start with PCA, Wesneski, and Ballesteros. You probably would have to throw in something like a Brennan or like a Ben Brown or something like that into it too. And that got all kinds of comments on Twitter. I was like, just some more satisfied customers, man.
I did an episode on that last year and mapped out some stuff, and it doesn't hold up well because some of the players' values have changed. Like Morel was red hot when I did it, so I made him the centerpiece of an Ohtani trade, and that just would not happen right now. I made Justin Steele one, but at this point, like the Cubs are trying to compete, they would not include Justin Steele in the Shohei Ohtani trade.
Yeah. Trades are wild, man. Like the process of like assembling these like trade packages before they actually happen feels almost impossible.
Yeah. Well, it's crazy too, but at the same time, we all like these prospects, and somebody can say, well, PCA is a untouchable for me, or Alcantara is an untouchable for me. But the reality is the Cubs have Casey and PCA and Canario and Alcantara, maybe Brennan Davis. Like they've got 5-6 guys that could be legitimate major league outfielders. Mm-hmm. They are never all going to start together in Chicago.
No, and it cracks me up. Like,
and some of them are not going to make it.
Yeah, exactly. Like some of them are not going to make it, and it just like it's back to the 2016, 2015, 2017, whatever it was. Like the Cubs have too many shortstops. Like it's like that thing.
It works itself out.
Yeah, it works itself out, and it cracks me up, like when I put that on Twitter. Like there's two types of people. There's prospect huggers, and there's prospects are worthless. Like there's those two sides. Like there's no middle ground people.
Danny Rocket and his prospect pervs.
Yeah, and so like it cracks me. Like so, if you want to get some fun out of it, go look at the replies to that tweet of mine, and you'll get some entertainment for a while.
Well, great. Thanks for joining me today. This is a lot of fun.
I appreciate it, Mike. I'll always, anytime you want me on, I'll always join.
Great. Hey, shout out where people can find you.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Out of the Vines, and then that's where I kind of post all my work. You can find, like we were talking about, the stat sheets over at northsidebound.com. Just go to northsidebound.com, I think /statistics, or you can just go to the main page of the website and click on the stats tab. I've got the hitting stats and the pitching stats separated out. You can go click on them. I'm still working on some logistics about, I want to be able to, so people can kind of have a static top row and static side row so they can constantly see the players and the stat they're looking at. That's some back-end stuff I'm still working on. I'll get there. But if you want to see all the numbers, they're updated daily over at northsidebound.com, so you can always be up to date on all the prospect numbers in the system. You can listen to me speaking over at Cubs on Deck podcast. That's anywhere where you listen to this podcast, I'm sure, on Apple, Spotify, all that good stuff. You can see us on YouTube over at the Northside Bound YouTube account. Typically, you see me and Brian. We're about every other week I'm with Brian, and then about once a month I'm with Greg Zumak, which is super fun. And then the next episode coming up here, I don't know when this episode drops, but will be with Sam Wiederhaft of the Myrtle Beach Pelicans. He's the broadcaster there. So I get the broadcasters on throughout the summer, get their perspectives, and that'll be some good stuff. So that's everywhere where you can find me.
And I'll tell the listeners those broadcaster interviews, those have been great. I've really enjoyed those.
It's almost like they should talk for a living, you know?
Almost, yeah. Well, great. It's good to see you. Good to have you back on the show. Thank you, and we'll talk again soon.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining Greg and I today. If you liked the discussion, or maybe especially if you didn't, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, or tell a friend about the show. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at CubsPS+. And check out the Patreon page at CubsPSPlus.patreon.com to help support the show and keep it ad-free. This is Mike Waller, host of the Cubs PS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!